Hello, welcome to a brand new video. Philosophy covers many categories from theology, ethics, politics, metaphysics, and many more, and has been an ongoing process for as long as people could think. The question is obvious. Considering the vastness of topics, where should one begin and what topics should one read? In this video, I'll try to guide you on what I think is the best way to get into philosophy for a beginner and based on different topics. While there's no perfect way for one person, this is the way I think is personally best and hopefully it works for you too. It's hard to argue against a chronological order since most philosophers work off of each other's thoughts and constantly reference each other. With that being said, let's begin with the work of Plato. The first book I recommend is Plato's Republic, followed by his 5 dialogues, Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Meno, and Phaedo, and luckily for you, we'll have a video going through each one of these in detail. In Plato's Republic, you have a back and forth dialogue between Socrates and different people he meets along the way, discussing topics such as justice, politics, the soul, and the nature of reality. And if you heard of the terms such as the allegory of the cave or the philosopher king, they all come from this book, and I have the Penguins Classics version, so that's the only one I can speak to, but I found it easy to read. I recommend reading his 5 dialogues next. You follow Socrates as he defends his life in court. He questions piety, teaches virtue, and in short, in Euthyphro, the first dialogue, Socrates discusses before his trial whether something is good because it's chosen by the gods, or is it chosen by the gods because it's good. In Apology, we go through Socrates' defense during the trial for the charges of impiety and for corrupting the youth, and his sentencing of death. In Crito, we read about Socrates' reasoning for not escaping jail. In Meno, or Meno, how you want to pronounce it, we discuss virtue and reincarnation with a theory of recollection. And in Phaedo, we talk about the immortality of the soul in Platonic metaphysics. Why I think Plato is important for beginners is that he teaches you how to philosophize. His dialogues aren't systematic treatises, some of which we'll see later, but dramatic reenactments or enactments of ideas being born in real time through the dialectical method of conversation. The Republic initiates you into the world of metaphysics and politics and questions that all Western philosophy revolves around, and while his dialogues are built upon these. Continuing with the Greeks, I recommend some selected portions of Aristotle, the student of Plato, and I also recommend some selected readings of Thomas Aquinas, who is arguably the greatest theologian of the West, and I recommend them for their metaphysical ideas, but I recommend reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics for his idea of virtue ethics, or the idea that good life is achieved through the cultivation of morals and intellectual virtues, with human flourishing being the ultimate goal, rather than it's not through rules or consequences, but becoming the kind of person who habitually does what is right. Most of what I learned about Aristotelian metaphysics was from Aquinas, so I recommend going through selected portions that I recommend first before jumping into Aristotle's metaphysics so you can get an overall picture of what you're going to see. For Aquinas, I recommend Summa Part 1, Question 2, Articles 1 through 5, which go over his 5 ways or arguments for the existence of God. Aquinas' 5 ways are 5 rational arguments for the existence of God, each beginning with empirical observations and ending in the necessity of a first cause or a prime mover. And these arguments include arguments for motion, causation, contingency, gradation, teleology. And in the Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 3, Article 4, we're discussing essence. And essence refers to what a thing is, its definition, its defining nature, or its quiddity. While existence, on the other hand, is the act of being. In contingent beings, essence and existence are distinct, but in God they're identical, and this is why he's uncaused and necessary. And you can read more about that in Thomas Aquinas on being and essence, but I recommend learning it from the Summa first, since it's easier to read in my opinion. In the Summa first part, question 3, it talks about the simplicity of God, or divine simplicity. And what that means is that God isn't composed of any parts, whether that's physical or metaphysical or conceptual, that there's no distinction between form and matter in God, or between essence or existence, or potentiality and actuality. In the Summa Part 1, question 75, we have hylomorphism, which is Aristotle's theory, but it was also adopted by Aquinas, and that's all material substances are composed of matter, hyle, and form, morph. And in human beings, the soul is the substance of is the substantial form of the body, and giving it life and unity and intelligibility as well. And moving on from Aquinas, for the selected readings of Aristotle, I recommend Physics 2-3 and Metaphysics Book 5 and chapters 2-4, which talk about causes such as material causes, formal causes, efficient causes, and final causes. Aristotle identifies these four causes to fully explain anything. That the material cause is what something is made of, the formal cause is its essential structure, the efficient cause is what brings it into being, and the final cause is its purpose or telos. In Book 7, Chapter 13 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, he talks about the relationship between universals and particulars, and he says that there's no universals apart from particulars. So Aristotle denied the existence of Platonic forms, which is something that you read about in the Republic, which I recommended earlier. So Plato said that universals existed independently of particulars, and they exist in a world of Platonic forms. It's a world of perfect forms, that there's a corresponding thing in reality it's like a perfect version or like the universal of it. So instead, universals, according to Aristotle, exist only in particular things as their forms. And this grounds knowledge and empirical relativity rather than avoiding a two-world metaphysics of Plato. So this is why in like the School of Athens by Raphael, you see Aristotle pointing down to the ground, or he's going like this, and then Plato is pointing up. In Book 8 of his Physics and Book 12 of his Metaphysics, we have Aristotle's argument for the unmoved mover. Aristotle argues that motion requires a mover, and to avoid infinite regress, there must be a first unmoved mover who is pure actuality without potentiality. And you can see with Aquinas, we mentioned earlier, with this 5 ways Aquinas builds on Aristotle's notion or his concept of the unmoved mover, especially in the first way. Next, what I recommend from Aristotle regarding his metaphysics and metaphysical system as a whole is his categories, which is part of this larger work. So Aristotle introduces a 10-fold classification of anything that exists. He classifies it into substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, situation, condition, action, and passion. So this is the classifying entities and how they can be predicated and understood. I don't recommend jumping straight into his book, The Metaphysics, since I found it difficult to read on its own, but hopefully by reading these excerpts first, it'll be a lot easier. And you can completely disagree with Aristotle and belief in God, and even though I disagree with you, but what we're trying to say is that a lot of philosophers, like I said in the beginning, work off each other's thoughts, and Aristotle is no different. Look at the influence he has in Aquinas and the different medieval and scholastic philosophers. So I recommend reading these excerpts so you can be familiar with the terms that he uses and what later thinkers use because they reference him so many times. As for his Nicomachean Ethics, I found it very straightforward, and he asks, how do we live life to its maximum? Like I mentioned earlier, Aristotle argues that good life is achieved through cultivation of moral and intellectual virtues, which are guided by practical wisdom. Aristotle argues that moral excellence arises from finding the mean between excess and deficiency. For example, courage is the mean between recklessness and cowardice. He also isn't philosophizing in a vacuum either. He emphasizes that human flourishing is not achieved in isolation, but within like a political and social environment where like things like reason and friendship and civil engagement play a central role, and he discusses all of these things in his book. So Plato asks, what is justice? Well, Aristotle asks, how should I live? And this paradigm shift is foundational and even for a beginner. Ethics matters because it grounds everything in philosophy in terms of lived experience. Aristotle's ethics isn't abstract, rather it's teleological, so everything has a purpose, including you. But the telos in your flourishing isn't handed to you according to Aristotle. It must be cultivated through habits, deliberation, and community. And this is why I recommend his Nicomachean Ethics for beginners. So now we're going to move into the future a few thousand years, or the future like relative to Aristotle. But we have Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. And this was the first philosophy book I ever read during my undergraduate studies, and I found it very straightforward to read. And if you ever heard the saying cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, it comes from this book. So in the book, Descartes tries to find a solid basis for all knowledge, and he accomplishes this by first doubting everything that can be doubted, including his senses, reality, and even mathematics, such as because an evil demon could be telling him that 1 + 1 = 2. Descartes' meditation goes into things such as epistemology, which is how we know things, and also goes into mind-body dualism, which is also going against, or it's a radical departure from the hylomorphism that we learned about with Aristotle. Descartes says the only thing that he can't doubt is that he's a thinking thing, and if he's thinking, there must be something that thinks, and therefore there's something that exists. And from this, he eventually makes an ontological argument for the existence of God, and I have a video going in detail as well about this argument. And what I also like about Descartes, like I mentioned about the hylomorphism, is that he's going beyond the Greeks and bringing a new stage of thought in modern philosophy. With Descartes, you learned what it means to rebuild your worldview from scratch, which is exactly what many beginners feel like they need to do. And whether you agree or disagree with Descartes, you walk away with knowing how modern thought began with the isolated thinking self. Next on my list is the exact opposite of Descartes. It's David Hume's An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. It's a foundational text in modern empiricism, and it's a sharp critique of traditional metaphysics and rationalist epistemology. And in it, Hume explores the limits of human reason and knowledge, and argues that all ideas ultimately derive from sensory impressions. According to David Hume, our belief in causation isn't grounded in logical necessity, but in custom and psychological habits, that we expect the future to resemble the past just because we've grown used to such patterns, not necessarily because we can prove it. For example, we see the sun coming up every day. Just because it happens doesn't mean it's going to happen the next day. So while Descartes held that we have innate ideas such as the idea of God or mathematical truths, or that we can know causation through reason, Hume denied all of this, claiming that ideas are derived from sense perceptions and that causation isn't real, or that we can't truly know if it's real or not. Reading both Descartes and Hume, I would say, are both prerequisites for reading Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, but that's definitely a book I wouldn't recommend for a beginner. Kant tries to synthesize Descartes into Hume's metaphysics into one working theory, and if you want to know more about that, I have a video on that as well. From this discussion so far about Hume, we can see that he's the necessary destabilizer. Yeah, that while Descartes gives us rational clarity, Hume on the other hand shows its limits, and the beginners need to read him because he challenges the illusion of certainty. Next, we're going to go back in time again, but this time to Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Imagine a Roman emperor with absolute power writing himself reminders to stay humble and calm and virtuous, and that's basically the Meditations. It's his raw, personal, unfiltered stoicism, and Marcus Aurelius offers timeless practical wisdom, and I highly recommend reading his book as well. Next I recommend is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract. So now we're in the realm of political philosophy. It was difficult for me to choose between this book and Hobbes' Leviathan or Locke's second treatise on government, since all three are foundational books in political philosophy, but I ultimately decided on Rousseau because for me it was more enjoyable to read his prose compared to the other two. And when Rousseau offers something more philosophical and emotional, I found comforting amongst his radical ideas. In the Leviathan, Hobbes argues that individuals in the state of nature are driven by fear and self-preservation, so they surrender their rights to an absolute sovereignty in exchange for security. Locke, on the other hand, claimed that individuals retain their natural rights to life, liberty, and property even after forming governments, and the governments exist to protect these natural rights, and you can overthrow the government if they fail to do so. And this is a sentiment that influenced Thomas Jefferson when he was writing the Declaration of Independence. So Rousseau discusses these two views in his Social Contract and attempts to provide a better alternative. He proposes that legitimate political power only comes from a social contract agreed upon by free individuals and is governed by something that he calls the general will. Rousseau's concept of the general will is that it's a collective will that aims at the common good. It's kind of like the spirit of the dialectic, and it emerges through the active, reasoned public debate where citizens set aside their own self-interests to seek the benefit of the community. So while people may have flawed decisions, the general will itself is always morally correct because it represents and expresses the collective pursuits of the common good. And once formed, the general will becomes binding upon all, and the government solely exists to carry it out. The book also begins with like the hardest line ever. He says, quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? That question I think I can answer." Political philosophy must eventually answer, why should I obey anyone? And Rousseau gives the beginner the tools to ask this deeply, and I also have videos on all three of these political philosophers for more information. Next, we're going to jump into some Eastern philosophy with the Upanishads. The Upanishads were composed around 800 to 200 BCE and are a collection of ancient Sanskrit texts that form the core of Hindu philosophy. And unlike the linear or syllogistic arguments of the Greeks, the Upanishads unfolds through aphorisms and dialogue and paradox as well. The Upanishads are about the relationship between the Atman, which is the self, and Brahman, which is the ultimate reality, and the fact that these are the same, that they're one in one, and they're just two sides of the same coin, I guess you could say that, and that the real world that we're living in is just an illusion or Maya, and this is known as non-dualism or Advaita. And the Upanishads explores the idea of consciousness, ethics, self-discipline, and the pursuit of liberation or moksha from the cycle of birth and death. The beginner is usually raised in Western categories and often assumes philosophies about logic and systems and propositions, but the Upanishads dissolves this assumption and teaches you to think outside the box. The beginner here gains humility and realizes that there's other ways to seek truth. Lastly, we have probably a surprising entry, but Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. It's probably the best point of entry into Kantian philosophy, and probably like 1,000 times more approachable than his text, his notoriously dense text, The Critique of Pure Reason. And in the Groundwork, Kant seeks to identify the supreme principle of morality through reason alone, rather than appealing to emotion or consequences or religious authority. So Kant argues that the only thing that's unconditionally good is a good will, and that's a will that acts not out of self-interest or inclination, but from duty, according to the moral law. And at the heart of this is his categorical imperative, which is known as, or rather demands of people to act only according to maxims which you can make into a universal law. And all this is known as deontological ethics. Kant's Groundwork represents a radical paradigm shift from the earlier theological views of morality, like those of Aristotle, which focused on virtue and flourishing, and it's also a shift from the consequentialist views, like those of utilitarianism, which focuses on outcomes. For Kant, the moral worth of an action lies not in its result, but in the motive behind it. And since we mentioned utilitarianism, I'm going to also throw in a bonus book, John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, to balance things out. And that brings us to the end of this video. So whether you're seeking truth in politics, ethics, metaphysics, or trying to find the meaning of life itself, this list should set you on a firm path. And don't just read or wrestle with these texts. See where you agree or disagree with them. And from there, you can come up with your own philosophical systems that 1,000 years from now people will still be talking about. And let me know in the comments below if you have any questions or if there's any books you think I should recommend as well that a beginner should read. And don't forget to like and subscribe as always.